I'd make a quick video tonight about the 2015 CRF125FB. This is a pretty awesome entry-level bike or learner, trainer bike for larger children or even for small adults to play around on, which is of course why I bought it. I figured I'd make this video more than anything else because there's not a whole lot, if any, aftermarket parts available for this bike. So I figured I'd make a video to kind of point out what the best parts out there for this bike are, what's out there, and of course what mods make the biggest difference on this bike and what I recommend. So stand by, and I'm going to have some tips and tricks coming your way about the 2015 CRF125FB. All right, one of the first things that a lot of people online on Thumper Talk and other pages recommend for this particular bike is if you have the opportunity, change out the rear sprocket. Factory, of course, is a 13 front and a 49 rear. I don't know if you can see that, but either way, this bike still has the factory gearing, factory sprockets. A lot of people recommend for the biggest change and the biggest improvement for the least amount of investment, change this rear out to a 46. I think that will probably give it a good bit more speed in each gear, and people seem to be satisfied with it. So for the most cost-effective approach to gaining a little bit of power, change out that rear sprocket. Another big and somewhat often overlooked mod that people should pay more attention to but don't always is tires. Of course, nothing is going to help you out more than being able to put that power down to the ground. A good set of tires, of course, is always a good way to achieve that pretty simply. Another thing that you can do that's really simple and easy right off the break is mess with those factory OEM bars. Either get yourself a good set of pro tapers, or you can roll the factory bars forward or backward to better accommodate your particular riding style. But it's amazing how much something that simple can make a huge difference, especially on a smaller bike that's, not meant for bigger riders. Another extremely good and oft overlooked investment is getting yourself a set of foldable or unbreakable levers, or if you can manage to pull it off, a set of good bark busters. Bark busters, of course, cost a good bit more money. These particular levers were actually really cheap. They're actually a set of MZS levers, I do believe. I got them online for, I don't know, 20 bucks or something. But it's a good insurance policy to ensure, of course, that when you do bail, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, you have these in place to help ensure that you can keep riding or at least ride away. Another big mod that people do, which honestly is pretty cheap, but at the same time is pretty effective, is a folding shifter. I don't have one on this particular bike. Tusk makes one. They're pretty cheap. They're usually about, I don't know, 30 bucks, 40 bucks. But it's, again, a good insurance policy, so that way when you do drop the bike, this doesn't break off and thereby, leaving you stranded or preventing you from racing onward. So, yeah. Right, now onto the good stuff. One of the big things you can do on this particular bike that makes a massive difference is to get rid of that OEM factory, extremely restrictive, very small exhaust. Of course, when you pull this off, you'll see a pretty noticeable and instantaneous boost in power. In this case, I went with the FMF PowerCore 4. It's a very affordable, pretty cheap exhaust overall. I think it cost about 200 bucks. It helps you retain the factory OEM heat shield, which is really nice, and honestly makes a big improvement in low-end torque, and even in your high end up in the power band. Of course, it does pretty darn well. So overall, I'm pretty impressed with this exhaust. For 200 bucks, you really can't beat it. I highly recommend everybody check that out as well. Another big mod that I definitely recommend is if you're a larger rider such as myself and you're going to be using this as a pit bike or playing around with it on the track, definitely change out that rear spring for BBR's rear spring for this bike. I believe it's a 975-pound spring, so of course it's going to do a lot better to handle the weight of a larger rider, especially jumping it and riding it aggressively. So if you have the opportunity, that usually runs about 100 bucks. I highly recommend that you change that out. The install process isn't too difficult, and I'm sure you'll see a video of that before too long, if I can find the footage. And last, but surely not least, the biggest thing that you can do on these bikes that makes a difference is to rejet the OEM carburetor, of course, especially if you install an aftermarket exhaust. I would definitely recommend, of course, that you at least rejet it. In this case, I believe OEM is 117 and 38, 117 main, 38 pilot. Of course, I bumped it up initially to a 120 and a 40, then I found it ran a little bit better with a 122 and a 42. What stinks about the OEM carb on this bike is that there is no way to make fuel screw adjustments. So there's no way to tune the carb after you've rejetted it. So it just kind of is what it is, which really stinks. So what a lot of people do for this bike that I've yet to do, that I'm going to do, is they change out the factory 20mm carb for a CRF125F 24 millimeter carb, and apparently it bolts right up. Everything is completely compatible. Even the factory intake boot slips right over top of it, and apparently that makes a massive difference overall for power. So of course, if you do the exhaust, it is recommended, of course, that you rejet the carb to match what you're doing. In this case, of course, what a lot of people do is there's a snorkel, a little rubber tube that sits on the top of the intake box. A lot of people pull that off, and it gives, of course, the bike a little bit more air, a little bit more free-flowing as well. There's also a backfire cage in here that you can remove. That's, of course, is a lot of people are on the fence as to whether that makes a difference or not. It definitely makes a difference in throttle response, but at the same time, it's not completely necessary. If you still find that the bike needs more air, Uni makes these individual 1-inch inserts that are foam inserts that you can drill holes into the air box and press these into place, and it gives the bike just a little bit more breathing. So again, if you're going to do exhaust, if you want the bike to run a little bit better, rejet it. They definitely run lean from the factory, and it's most definitely not going to hurt. One more thing I figured was worth mentioning. BBR also makes a front spring set for this bike, so you can change out the front springs as well. So that way, I guess you have a more symmetrical front to rear suspension response, I guess. Or if you're a larger rider and you just want a stiffer setup in the front, that's one solution to that problem. Another backyard solution I've seen people do is they'll take 1-inch sections of PVC and they'll actually cut them into sections and drop them down in here and then put the cap back on to increase the spring tension in the front. So it essentially accomplishes a similar task without actually replacing the entire spring assembly. So that's an option for you. I weigh about 186 pounds. I found that just replacing the BBR rear spring has been more than sufficient in my case. Of course, if you're a heavier rider or a more aggressive rider, I think that you might want to go with a front suspension mod as well, but of course that's up to you. So I definitely figured it was worth mentioning. Everybody, thanks for watching. This kind of concludes the video for the most part, but just to recap, a couple things you can go over or replace on the bike if you're looking to make a little bit more power or just make the bike more user-friendly for what you're doing. You can always change out the sprockets. Of course, factory is a 13 and 49. You can go to a 46 rear. That definitely helps things out. Change out your tires, swap out your bars, set up your ergonomics right, get the bike set up for you so it feels right for you. Of course, change out your levers if need be. I always recommend it. It's a good insurance policy. Change out your shifter too if it applies to you. Of course, change out your rear spring if you're looking for a little bit stiffer ride, and of course you want to land smoothly on jumps instead of bottoming out the rear shock every time you land. And change out the front springs if need be, if you feel that's necessary. Another big thing you can do, of course, is replace the exhaust and naturally change the jetting when you do so, or replace the carb if you feel that's necessary. So again, my review of the 2015 CRF125FB is a pretty positive one. The bike is definitely not a powerhouse by any means. I think it makes like 9 horsepower overall, but it's definitely a fun bike to ride, and it's still small enough that someone like me who's about 6'3", can ride it and enjoy it, and I can just kind of hop off of it and let it go if worse comes to worse. So again, thanks for watching. We definitely appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them in the comment section below, and leave us a like if you feel like it, and we'll see you next time.